Good evening. Welcome to Chasing Childhood, a community film discussion. I'm Elisa Magadoff, Associate Director at the Center for Children and Youth, a division of Jewish Family and Children's Services. I will be facilitating our discussion today. I'd like to share a couple of housekeeping notes. We will be using the Q&A box for this program. If you have any questions throughout, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will have time at the end of tonight's conversation to answer a few questions. Following tonight's events, a recording will be made available to all participants for 2 weeks. We could not have the wonderful community engagement and audience without our event sponsors, community partners, and you. Thank you. And thank you to Imagination Lab Schools of Palo Alto and Real Films for making this film, Chasing Childhood, accessible to us. The Center for Children and Youth, a division of Jewish Family and Children's Services, has been caring for individuals, children, families, and the elderly in the Bay Area since 1850. And it has been there for our community through pandemics, fires, medical emergencies, and several recessions. During each of these crises, JFCS has carried out its mission to make sure no one is alone and has grown into one of the largest and most effective family service institutions in the nation. The recent pandemic has had a great impact on us all with continued and serious challenges, especially around mental health. These issues are a priority we are addressing at all levels, from clinical treatment, parent and community education, to our partnership work in schools and advocacy. At the Center for Children and Youth, our team cares for the whole individual and family, providing expert services on behalf of children, teens, and their families. We hope you enjoyed your documentary, Chasing Childhood. If you have not already seen the film, and your link will be accessible until December 19th. While Chasing Childhood was filmed before the COVID-19 pandemic, tonight's discussion explores critical questions that are profoundly relevant today. Across America, free play has virtually disappeared for today's children, while stress and expectations have skyrocketed. Parents and experts are ringing the alarm bell about the rise in anxiety and depression in children, and exploring how less adult oversight and more free play could make a difference. We are thrilled to be talking with two of the greatest minds on raising healthy children and teens this evening, Dr. Madeline Levine and Dr. Ken Ginsberg. Dr. Madeline Levine is a psychologist, educator, and New York Times bestselling author. You may know her books, The Price of Privilege and Teach Your Children Well. Her most recent book, Ready or Not, focuses on how to best prepare our children and ourselves for an uncertain and rapidly changing world. Dr. Levine is also co-founder of Challenge Success, a project of the Stanford Graduate School of Education, and a member of our own expert panel, as well as our advisory board here at the Center for Children and Youth. Dr. Ken Ginsberg is also a member of the Center for Children and Youth's expert panel. His work includes authoring a report for the American Academy of Pediatrics on the importance of play in promoting a healthy childhood. He is a pediatrician specializing in adolescent medicine, an author, a professor of pediatrics at the University of Pennsylvania, and the co-director of the Center for Parent and Teen Communication at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. The theme that ties together all his incredible work is that of building on the strength of teenagers by fostering their internal resilience. All right, so I would like to start this discussion with Madeline and Levine and Ken Ginsberg, and I want to thank you both for joining us today.
Pleasure.
It's an absolute honor to be with you this evening.
Did you have a few words that you would like to say? Either of you? Or should we get right into our discussion?
I actually have one thing I'd like to say, and that's we're doing this in the midst of one of the most difficult times this country has known. And I think it's just really important to put out there that it's clear that there are two Americas. There are multiple Americas, but there are many Americas out there with different needs, and that people need to totally understand that what Ken and I have to say, most of it's rooted in research, but nobody knows your family or your kid as well as you do. So keep that in mind. That's all.
Thank you, Madeline.
Sure.
I appreciate that. All right. Why does it matter that parents see children beyond their accomplishments or performance?
I'll take a crack at answering that in a sentence, I think worth remembering, which is, why do we love? We love so that our children know that they're worthy of being loved, right? And there's no doubt that the most protective factor in a young person's life is to be seen, to be known, to be valued by their parents. It's that their entire sense of security is going to come from adults who really know them, who really see them, loving them without condition, and holding them to high expectations. And those high expectations can't be about what they're accomplishing or how they're performing. It's got to be about living to be your best self, like who they really are. And when parents know who a person really is, what they're capable of, what their strengths and limitations are, and continue to absolutely love them, that's what allows you to navigate all the trials of life, because the people who know you most see you. And when they see only their accomplishments or their performance, young people feel invisible to their parents, and they don't gain that vital protection that parents can offer.
I guess what I'd add to that is that's exactly right, Ken. It's like the 4 S's: seen, soothed, secure. Excuse me, my voice is going. I think what I'd like to add about it is I actually think that all that attention to accomplishments is a form of lazy parenting. And the reason I feel that is because grades and award, they're very easily quantified. So it's easy to know how your kid is doing and to give into the pressure to think that that's what life is about. But as Ken says, that's nowhere near what life is about. And I'm a grandma now of 2 little ones. And I get to see something Ken and I have talked about, that life as a parent is not a snapshot. If you're just looking at that grade, that college, that day, you have a very narrow view of what it means to parent. Your parenting is a movie. I think you used to call it a 30-year timeline, but it's a movie. And now that I have grandchildren and my kids are grown up, what matters is that they're in good relationships. What matters is that they're good parents, that they're kind, that they have work that they like, that they have good values, all the things that can't be quantified or are very difficult to quantify. And, you know, when I look now at parents' anxiety about the grade of the school, you know, you never want to say, take my word for it. I've just said every family is different, but it just isn't what matters at the end of the day. You want a good kid with all that implies.
Amen. And the term that I've used is to remember that you're parenting your 35-year-old, and you think about who is the 35-year-old that we're trying to produce. And we'll talk about this further, but I think you're also parenting a child to be successful in their second job. and let's develop that later. But the point really is that parents think high yield parenting is about focusing on grades or behavior. So they're going to put in most of their efforts on those two things when really high yield time is having a human being be seen and be enjoyed and be valued. Nothing's more important.
Right.
Great.
And Ken, I'm curious what you think, when you said to know that kid, my experience is that kid is in process, right? Like you take an 8-year-old kid or a 10-year-old, they're nowhere near finished. And so parents have to also really love the process as it goes along, right?
Absolutely. Development is a miracle. And when parents are into their child's development, they're going to see them change and everything else. But I am going to throw in one thing, Madeline, which my guess, because we almost always agree, you'll agree with as well, is that there are elements, there are certain character strengths that are evident from the very earliest years.
Oh, absolutely.
And I actually think that seeing these things in your 3-year-old, their generosity, their sense of fairness, their commitment even to justice, sometimes their stubbornness, all these things you can see in your 3 to 4-year-old, it develops. But I actually think seeing it in that 3-year-old protects you during the adolescent years. Because when your kid strays away from their essential core self, it's how you know who they've always been that brings them back. So yes, people change in development, but knowing your child, those essences never change and will be so helpful later when they're behaving as if they might be changing. Make sense?
Yeah, it does. Although since you and I like chatting with each other, I'm not, now that I have these 2 little ones, things change. I think things change. Temperament's there for good, at about 3 or 4. And I, having raised 3 kids, you've raised a bunch of kids. I do think it's a dynamic process. And, the line like genetics loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger. I think depending on the environment that a kid is in and what happens in life, right? You can lose a parent, you can have a serious illness, all those things can happen that change trajectories. So I think you and I see this just slightly differently. I understand what you're saying about essence, but I'd also underscore that environment has a big impact and that can make changes.
I would agree with you emphatically. I agree with everything you say. What I'm talking about is even in a shifting or uncertain world, being able to create that centering experience. It doesn't deny the shifting world, but it talks about the central role of parents. But we're going back and forth. And,
yeah, right.
and Alyssa has
which
other thoughts
we're
as well.
one. Good luck, Alyssa.
Yeah.
Wow. So, all right. How about, can either one of you talk about the benefits of a less curated childhood?
I'll start with that one. So, and I have a story. And when I wrote Ready or Not, it was because this came out 2 weeks before lockdown. The world had already been changing radically. And I went to different sources for that book, not my usual band of psychologists and educators. I went to CEOs and the military because I wanted people who were always changing and see the need for change. And they kept talking about this new skill set that was more important to them, increasingly important. And the story, so that happened. The story I have is I go to get my house remortgaged, and my youngest son, Jeremy, at that point, who's about 20, wants to come with me. He does. I happen to get the head of the mortgage department. We talk for about 90 minutes, and he's just being who he is, talk about the soul of a child. He's just being, Ma, I think the meter's running out. Can I put a quarter in? Sure. Ma, you can hear my throat. It's always scratchy. I saw tea and some honey. Can I get that for you? And he turns to the woman who's the head and says, can I get you a cup of tea? 90 seconds out of 90 minutes. I get my mortgage, and she turns to my son and says, I want to offer you a job. And she knows nothing about him, not whether he's in college, not whether he's a creative or is interested in finance. So of course I'm like, could you tell me more about that? And she said, I can teach him the skill set that he needs. I can't teach him to be the person I want next to me in case I have a sore throat. And the book started with that. I mean, I'd been getting that, but that was really personal, and I saw it in real life. And the more I talk to people, the more convinced I am that and I don't, wait a minute, I don't ever want to be understood as being anti-intellectual or, lowering the bar, which is hysterical to me because I'm a Jewish PhD from New York, and my husband is what my own children like to call a real doctor. So we're not known for low standards or disinterest in education, it's not like that. But I think what Ken and I are talking about is how do you optimize kids' learning and curiosity and collaboration and all the things that are certain to be increasingly important as the world becomes more uncertain.
I love that story,
that
Madeline.
great?
That's such a great story. It's also how what we think about hiring people at Covenant House. We're looking for that sense of commitment to people rather than necessarily their degrees. With that said, I want to add that when we curate childhood, we manage them and suggest which activity they should do next. We decide as adults, rather than seeing them as experts in their own lives, what we think is good for them. And by definition, that's going to stifle someone's creativity. Mm-hmm. And creativity is one of the great things you need for success. That comes through play, that comes through trial and error, that comes from falling down and getting back up. It comes from exploring the world. And then we have to remember, there's so many different ways of describing development, but one of our major missions as human beings is to achieve identity development, mm-hmm. to be able to say, who am I and how am I going to contribute? How am I different from my family, different from my friends, the same? Will I matter to other people? How do I find meaning in my life? These are the big, juicy questions, right. And they have to be answered by an individual. Mm-hmm. And that individual has to try on different hats, and they have to fall down, and they have to get back up, and they have to see what they like. And play literally is trying on different hats. That's literally what it is. And when we prevent people from finding different hats to try on, why? Because I have one that fits you quite nicely, right? then we're curating childhood and we're stifling development.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think, Ken, excuse us for a minute, Elisa and everybody, why do you think we have a tolerance for that with young children? Like you use the example, fall down and get up. So with a young child, they fall down and nobody gets hysterical. You go, come on, sweetheart, get up. And you applaud that she fell down and got up again. We don't have that attitude. And we understand that in order to learn how to walk, that's the experience that's necessary. And when a child's babbling, we don't say, don't talk to me till you can speak in full sentences. We like the fact that it's a mishmash in the beginning and the kid fails. But we lose that investment in our own curiosity about what it takes to master something. Because to master something, you have to fall down. The best example is that young child learning to walk. I'm really curious why we lose that curiosity ourselves. Clearly we feel there's more at stake for an older kid in a mistake. but the same value that we understood for a 2-year-old, why don't we understand that for a 12-year-old?
I'm not sure I have the wisdom within me to really answer that question fully, but I'll take a stab at it.
Great.
And I think that you answered it partly by saying that the stakes seem higher. Now you're talking about behaviors that aren't about toppling over a lamp. They're behaviors that are about choices around what's going to affect your career, choices that could include dating and other sexual behaviors. And it makes people really scared. And we all remember our adolescent years and our own struggles with identity development. And sometimes those felt uncomfortable. And we try to spare our children that discomfort without understanding that we grew from it.
Right.
And then the final piece isn't really about parents. It's about the rest of society defining success narrowly and having parents feel like in order to have successful children, they have to get them onto this one specified pathway. And you and I and all of our colleagues at Challenge Success that we are so proud of being affiliated with would make a strong argument that success is different for different people, and there are multiple pathways to success. And I believe intensely that people need to celebrate their unevenness in order to find out how they really excel. I come by that honestly because I'm the most uneven person on the entire planet. But people are uncomfortable with unevenness.
But Ken, the reality is, like, for that book, I have a whole section on successful people. And of the people I know, none of them took that straight line. I mean, I was a failed teacher in the public school system in the South Bronx. That's part of how I became a psychologist. Almost everybody has that path. And there's this myth, I think, about, whoa, you take that straight path and that's your ticket. But it's actually not the path that the vast majority of successful people have taken.
The most successful people in the world are spiky. They're people who are really, really good at something and not very good at many other things.
Right.
Personally, I think I'm quite good at being a doctor. I think I'm good at being a communicator. My car got sick last week, and by that, it's defined as the low pressure sign went off, right? And I had to call my wife to figure out how to handle it, right? I am so uneven, and we don't allow people, if we don't accept unevenness,
But
then
that's
what
a myth.
happens is, it's a complete myth.
It's the myth. Yeah.
But the point is, if we accepted unevenness, we would have more successful human beings because they could focus on their strengths rather than having massive anxiety about their limitations.
Right. And so I think it's really important. There are kids who need tutors for sure, but most kids, the call that comes to the office is, can I talk to you, Dr. Levine? And my kid got 4 A's and a C. And I know they're calling about the C, not the 4 A's. And it's like, nobody's good at everything. Harvard Business did research on how many skills you need to be outstanding at to be C level. And it's 2. And another study found 3, but that's it. And it's not straight A's across all things. You didn't know what to do with your car. And my visual spatial is the worst. Same like you, I'm verbal, but not visual spatial at all. So that's just the reality. And that ought to be a big banner. Nobody's good at everything, in the schools and at home.
Yeah.
Okay. Many youth appear accomplished on paper, yet are struggling emotionally. What tools can be provided to allow them to navigate young adulthood?
Ken, you're younger than me. When you were in training, was emerging adulthood a fact of life? Were there emerging adulthood programs around the country?
Not that I recall. I emerged without such support, certainly. No, I mean, just remember that even the concept of adolescence isn't that old, right? And so the concept of emerging adulthood, I think, really got a lot of support as we learned more about the brain and the ever evolving brain.
Mhm.
So I think that it's not a coincidence that these two things have come out together, but also adolescence, Madeline, in our time. I mean, since I've been an adolescent specialist, the definition of adolescence has expanded, right? It used to kind of end at 18. Now everybody knows it goes through 24,
24.
you know?
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. So, I mean, one of the things I think is that in parents' well-meaning but misplaced attempts to protect their children and make sure their children are totally focused on getting good grades is something that I'm calling accumulated disability, which is this tendency, as soon as a kid is having some difficulty, to step in and allow them to avoid the difficulty. And avoidance is a pretty bad way to approach difficulty. So my favorite story from my book is this girl that I saw who didn't like sauce. She wasn't allergic. She just didn't like sauce. And her mother accommodated to that, accommodated to her dislike and anxiety about sauce. And then when she was little, it wasn't a problem. But then she started going to other people's houses. Mom would have to call up and say, you know, my daughter doesn't like sauce. And her invitations dropped off. This idea that part of a parent's job is to protect their child from anxiety is, I think, extremely mistaken. And I think it's in those confronting those things that are difficult in that gray zone of the zone of proximal development. That's exactly where growth takes place. And I think a lot of kids are hobbled because way too much avoidance has been encouraged, and they haven't developed the muscle to confront life, which is tough. Life is tough. The last talk I gave before lockdown, I had maybe 500 people at Burke School here in San Francisco. And I asked, how many of you haven't had a divorce, a bankruptcy, a serious illness, a problem with your children, you know, and everybody except one person raised their hand. That is life. And so I think you need a kind of muscularity to be able to face life, and you are prevented from getting it if there's too much interference with those uncomfortable moments when your kid has to navigate challenge.
I agree with everything you said, and I thank you, Alyssa, for the question. You know, as a guy who's focused on resilience and who also studies and works with childhood trauma, sometimes resilience is defined as like overcoming adversity or bouncing back, as if that's the end goal. In fact, though, when you've got your resilience skills down, you're able to thrive in the best of times, like knowing how to deal with discomfort, having the skills to be able to rebound are also the same skills that allow you to get the most out of life. And Alyssa, I noticed that in your question, you asked the word for tools. And I struggled when you said the word tools, because I was like, oh, let me think of a tool. And just keep it more broadly. And to understand it is this comfort with discomfort. And it's a parent's idea, because there's very few villains in parenting. Let's start there. And absolutely none of them are watching this today. Right? You don't watch a discussion between us if you're like, so everybody wants to do the best thing. There's no question about it. So here's your mantra. Preparation is protection, right? If you think that protection is the bubble wrap, then in fact, your child isn't going to be ready for when times get tough. But you have to let them be exposed so they can grow from each opportunity. But it is more than okay to prepare them with social skills, with other kind of skill sets that enable them to bounce, to have real conversations with them about hardship and overcoming hardship, to help them understand that anxiety is about feeling like there's a tiger about to attack you. And if you never look the tiger in the face, you're always going to think it's hiding in the grass. But if you learn to actually see it, then actually your anxiety will go down because you'll learn that you have survived looking the tiger in the face, right? So again, I agree with everything that Madeline said.
Well, so I have a question, which is, my experience is people tend to think of resilience as like you're a resilient kid or you're not. And that, since you're the king of resilience, could you address that? Because I think it's another myth that you have a resilient kid or you don't, and that kid is resilient across all situations. It's not my experience.
It's just not factual. So resilience is uneven, like everything else. And what resilience is definitively not is invulnerability, right? We don't want our kids to be invulnerable. We want our kids to feel, to care. What I always say, and Madeline, you've heard me say this, to look out in audiences and say, if you have a kid who's a little bit more anxious, a kid who's a little bit more sad and a little bit more intense, I know that might be stressing you out, but congratulations. Did you want to have a kid who didn't feel? Your job during adolescence, our job during adolescence, is to support these young people to be able to leverage those emotions that they have. So resilience is absolutely something that can be built. It is absolutely uneven. And what we don't want to do is define it as a fixed trait, because then you're going to begin making people feel bad for struggling. Instead, we want to say that the struggle is how you build resilience. And the way in which you build it is by connecting with other human beings who support you through the struggle, who help you to regulate your emotions. So it should be pseudo-academic for a minute. There are aspects of resilience that some people will do better than others, depending on their baseline anxiety and intelligence and things like that. But absolutely, it can be built in everybody. And nobody, including the guy who writes books about this stuff, like has figured it all out.
Right.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. What role do you think that schools should play in protecting mental health?
So I have written on my notes for this in big letters, duh. And the reason I have that written there is because it strikes me that the question is like, what are you talking about? If school is only for cognitive development, then it sort of makes sense. But that's not what education is. Education is, from my perspective, about cognitive development, emotional development, mental development. It's about a whole social development. And given that, schools have to have a role because, first of all, kids don't learn well when those things aren't attended to. And the learning, I think we need a much broader idea about what it takes to educate a kid to go out into the world. And I think, Ken has done an excellent job of sort of explaining the ballast that you need internally in order to be a successful human being. And it starts very early with your parents and then with, the people who are authority figures in your life. And those are your teachers. So they should definitely play a significant role in mental health. I can't imagine it otherwise.
So of course I agree with Madeline, but I'm going to take a different tack to the answer, just to move it in a different direction. So as somebody who thinks about catching kids before crisis, and I just want to point out how vital teachers and counselors and psychologists in school are, right? We we send our kids to spend the day with child development specialists, 6-8 hours, depending on if they're staying after school and whatnot. And so a lot of what I do in the world is I do focus on parenting, but I also focus on supporting professionals how to be the kind of people young people deserve in their lives. And when I'm before a teacher audience or a school-based audience, I tell them from the bottom of my heart, they're the most important people in society, other than, of course, parents, because we need them to have their eyes on young people. We need them to see, define success differently than just academics, but to also understand the markers that suggest a kid might be in trouble. And that may be traditional grades changing, school failure. It may be, but it may just be a young person who's more irritable, who's sitting alone in the cafeteria, who is bullied in class. There's so many opportunities for these wonderful people we call educators to be connected and to be the feelers and the sensors out there to catch kids in crisis before it hits.
Mhm. And I think I just want to add to that, because I was a teacher, as I have already said, a very bad one, but I was a teacher. And I think it's important for parents to have a degree of, people might not like this, greater respect for educators than they do. You know, teachers will pick up a phone at 11 o'clock at night because somebody's concerned about a grade their kid got. And I think that's a mistake. I think personally that being a teacher is the hardest job on the planet. And look at what teachers have had to accommodate to and adjust to in this period of time. I think it's mind-boggling. You know, nobody knew about distance learning. It's distance, it's hybrid, it's this, it's that. It's like, be good to your kids' teachers, I guess is my message.
Okay.
We're not hearing you, Alyssa. You're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I was
Yep.
going to say, this one has you written all over it. Should children take risks to build resiliency?
I assume you meant me because like I write
Yeah.
the resilient stuff. Madeline
did.
also is quite the expert.
I
on
did,
resilience.
but
and-
you called
and-
yourself the king.
Go, Ken.
No, I did not call myself the king. She called me the king. If I called myself the king, I'd be a bad man. Okay. You know, literally by definition, the answer is that it is the risk that will allow you to build resilience. But let's define risk more clearly.
Thanks.
There are things that you knew at 2 years old to never allow your child to do, like put their hand on the stove. And there are, or run into the street. And there are things we absolutely must protect our children from, because there are lots of hand on the stove moments throughout childhood and adolescence. Getting into a car with someone who's been drinking, right? Certain sexual activities that are unprotected. There's lots of hand on the stove moments. Let's be clear about that. And we do not want our children to take those risks. But what do we want them to do? We have to understand that, in fact, children are super learners, especially when they become adolescents. They need to learn, they need to have experiences in order to build their brain, because the knowledge that they get in during this period is going to last them a lifetime. Where does knowledge, where do they learn? They learn at the edges of existing knowledge. They have to push boundaries. So kids are not natural risk takers, they're natural explorers. And risk, if you're going to define it as new opportunities, pushing limits, the answer is we must have those kind of risks. So what do adults do if we're going to do it well? The first thing we do is we set very clear boundaries beyond which you cannot stray, right? That doesn't restrict kids. What that does is it gives them the freedom to go against those boundaries. It allows them more opportunities to be natural explorers, natural experimenters. So we create very clear boundaries. What else do we do? We create golden opportunities at those boundaries for people to really learn the lessons, to satisfy their brains that are literally wired to go with new experiences. So when we create golden opportunities at these edges and say, but you can't go beyond here, then young people learn, they stop, they take healthy risks, which is called exploration. And success and failure and all the other ways we said. So it's very important, I think, that we get our language right. I, and I'm sure Madeline, are not saying it's good for your kids to take risks with drugs. We're not saying that. We're saying let our children test their boundaries, explore their limits under your protective eye. And then the one other thing you want to do is role model what a healthy adulthood looks like. And if you role model what a healthy adult looks like, kids test their own limits, but they look back to make sure they're doing what seems good and appropriate. And you're saying, I'm creating clear boundaries for you, not to restrict you, but because I love you, right? That's the message.
And I think it's worth noting how incredibly difficult that can be for a parent. When your kid is taking risks and it hits your anxiety, your own anxiety, and you know you have to tolerate it. So my little story is my youngest kid who had asthma is invited to rock climbing camp in Yosemite. His asthma is under control, but there's no hospital there. And I know it's good for him to go. I know it. He's probably 11 or 12 at the time. He breathed fine that whole weekend. I'm not sure I took a breath because it was terrifying to me. But I want to acknowledge that what we're asking people to do is not easy. And sometimes you know the right thing to do and it still raises your own anxiety. But I think that in terms of a kind of co-regulation between a child and a parent, which I think goes on all the time, that to the extent to which you can stay cool, your kid can borrow your calm about those. I used to be terrified of flying. So the minute we hit turbulence, I'm looking right at the stewardess, expecting her to go nuts, and she's just handing out, peanuts or something. I borrowed her calm, and I think kids do that with us. So it's important, even when we have some anxiety, that we do a little breathing and understand that it's good for our children, and it's good for us to learn how to manage that anxiety that we're feeling. But I don't want it to sound like, oh, just let your kid push those boundaries without acknowledging that it can be hard.
Yeah, I'd like to take the co-regulation thing even a step further.
Sure.
Madeline, we are so similar that we use the same metaphors. Like, it's amazing. So let me give you another metaphor. So the if you have a 4-year-old, you want to look like the duck gliding on the water. Like everything's just chilling. You seem to have it handled. There's a little bit of turbulence, but you're just like, okay. That's what a 4-year-old needs to see. If you look like the duck gliding on the water during turbulence to an adolescent, you actually look like a fool and they're not going to learn anything from you. What you want to look like to the adolescent is the little duck who's staying on top of the water because his little feet are paddling like crazy. And what kids really learn from us, not when we make it look easy, but when we show how we're making it through it, even though it's hard. That's the best teaching. So be the duck with the water, paddling under the water, and show them your coping skills, show them when you're struggling. That's good parenting.
Right. So Ken, when you and I were on the road for years and years and years, and when I used to be on the road, I would call my kids after every talk that I gave, and I would tell them what went wrong. And, it was never like a big deal. It was like, my slides weren't right. That's how long ago it was. Or I tripped going up the stairs, or my dress was not ready or whatever it was. And it's become a family joke because it was all like, that's being an adult and you got to solve those things. And so it's not that I didn't tell them that I had a good time and it was a good audience, I did, but every time I told them whatever the little snag was, because that's what being an adult is. So yeah, I love that.
We have one more. How can parents foster positive growth in young children?
I'll take the first lead on that. You know, I am an adolescent doc, but I do want you to know that I taught nursery school as well. And I'm a child development like major, whatever. My biggest thing is no matter what the age of the child is, treat them as the expert in their own life.
Mhm.
Right? Like really treat them as the expert in their own life. That doesn't mean they have the answers. It doesn't mean like they have the wisdom of years, but what they do have is an understanding of the world in which they navigate. And when we do that, and kind of let them set the tone a little bit, like you can share your wisdom, but always say, what do you think? Right? And in the case of little kids, like really little kids, you know, we started by talking about play. What a better way to get to know your child than to watch them play and create their reality.
Mhm.
That's letting someone be the expert in their own life. So it begins at very, very young ages that we have a style that allows us to get to know our child by watching them be themselves.
Right. Totally agree with what Ken just said. I mean, I'm in the middle of that with young children, with a 3-year-old and a 3-month-old who are my grandchildren. And it is such a great experience because none of the exhaustion that you have when your own children are 3 and 3 months old is there. And one of the things I'm really aware of, kids temperamentally are incredibly different. I mean, we knew that. We knew our kids were different, but I also think being fine with those differences in temperament and skills and stuff like that is really important because I can see how early you start to want your kid to sit quietly, or you take, you know, the shy child and start saying, you're being a bump on the log, get out there and, you know, make friends. And I feel in my own life, Ken, I learned my best parenting deal was really loving the fact that my 3 kids were incredibly different. And I wrote at night always, so getting sleep was important to me in the morning. And it was my middle creative kid who would wake me up every morning to see the sunrise. And back then it was like, oh my God, I never would have seen a sunrise if I hadn't wanted to join with him in that. And you know, a lot of things that you and I have spent a lifetime treating kids, a lot of things that people label as problems or pathology, or, you know, my kid can't sit still. Well, he's an 8-year-old boy and he's roaming around and trying to figure stuff out. I think we're a little too, personally, I think we're a little too quick, especially with boys, to pathologize things as opposed to really enjoying the differences among kids. See the child in front of you. That's how I started my career, with that line. You got to see your kid, that kid.
So this is off topic, but some of you may have noticed I'm a boy, and you've probably noticed that I've never stopped spinning this entire time. I needed to stand up in order to be able to focus and change the camera position. And if only when I was growing up, I was able to move and use my body as a way of maintaining focus instead of being told to please sit still. My childhood would have been very, very different. So thank you for saying that.
Well, thank you for that, Ken, because that 100% agreed. I want to thank you both for this really wonderful discussion. And I think it's time now that we open up for questions from the audience.
Okay.
All right. So how is it possible? Okay, it's the big one. How is it possible to raise children in this way when the world works otherwise? I believe in a less curated childhood, but it also somewhat competes with today's pressures to get a good education. I think about this all the time. I believe in following the child's identity and interests, but I worry that my children will be able to provide for themselves in this incredible, costly world.
So Madeline, because you're the real expert in this, can I try a first answer and
Absolutely.
then you develop it? So the first thing is, thank you for your honesty. Thank you for expressing that ambivalence, because we are all feeling that, and that is why things have not changed easily. With that said, you talked about wanting your child to be successful. I also want your child to be successful. I want my children to be successful. And that's why I raised my children, to use a metaphor, to be prepared for their second job, rather than focusing on which college they got into, which is a very specific set of skill sets that suggest that, knowing everything, getting straight A's, filling in this box and that box and this box gets you your first college. Let's look at what really happens. This generation is spending under 2 years at their first job, 18 months, I believe it is. So your real question is, what gets you your second job? And the second boss does not go to the first boss and say, how'd she do on her SATs? Was she captain of the lacrosse team? Like, that's never going to happen. The second boss is going to say, does she get along with other people? Can she take constructive feedback? Is she a creative thinker? Does she grow on the job? These are the questions. So if you really care about your child being successful, understand that society may be pushing one particular model of success, but society might be wrong, right? It might be wrong. And if you really care about your child's success, think about those skill sets that get them to be a healthy 35-year-old and for their second job. Madeline, you're more wisdom than I do, for sure.
Yeah, it's, pretty much the same, although I think it's worth pointing out that that narrative is a money-based narrative, money for the corporations that are pushing all of this stuff that you think you need to make your child successful. There was a suit against baby Einstein, and the research on baby Einstein, which everybody had in their house and thought it would make their kids smarter, was that it actually impaired development. It actually, at the rate of 8 words a month, was those kids who'd been exposed. Why? Because they're sitting passively looking at a screen as opposed to talking with you. So, this explosion of materials that you get from colleges courting your children, or from SAT services that are trying to sell you their wares, they all have a financial interest in this. And it didn't just happen. It happened because it was a great way. It's an industry. And I think, you must have had this experience, Ken, you're signing books, right? And one woman says to you, I totally agree with you, Dr. Levine, but I'm the only one in my community. I sign her book. The next woman comes up, totally agree with you, but nobody else does. And I'm like, go talk to that lady because she does agree with you. So you're not alone in feeling that this is a mistaken notion about what it takes to be successful.
Yeah, you're not alone. Look at what Challenge Success is saying. Look at what Making Caring Common is saying. Listen to all the people who agree with you. And Madeline, that's absolutely my experience. In fact, I leverage that, and I'm very specific about it. I say to school communities, you can change your school culture, but only if you join together, because you can be certain that the principal or the headmaster is hearing most from the parents who are saying, why is it my child can't take the 7th or the 6th AP class? That's who is getting their attention. And we have to make sure that our community members are who care about the social and emotional growth and development of their children have a loud enough voice.
Right. And sort of not to end on a downer at all, I'll bring it around, but I have a kid who's taking AP Calculus, and his father is so anxious about his performance that his father graphs his test results every time he gets a pop quiz or a quiz. He's taking AP Calculus, right? He can graph his own calculus. Why is he in my office? Because he's got trichotillomania. He's pulling everything, his hair, his eyebrows, his eyelashes out. And Dad's response to me is, he'll stop it when he gets into MIT. And my response is, probably not, that this is how he's learned to deal with this kind of pressure. There is a cost to always feeling pressured, whether you're 60 or 70 years old, like we are, or you're 8 years old. There is, people have just so much bandwidth, which we're seeing right now in the middle of COVID. And be aware that if you buy into a narrative that's harmful to your child, you don't have to, but you risk a child who pulls out his eyelashes.
And he won't be pulling out his eyelashes at MIT probably. So the tragedy is that this child will have launched into adulthood feeling like a failure because success was so narrowly defined.
Mm-hmm.
And so he'll be pulling out his eyelashes, most probably statistically at a place other than MIT.
Right.
So that's the tragedy.
Right.
Okay, the next question says the film focuses on the hurdles that society has put in front of kids. How can things be changed to achieve the goals you are articulating?
You started home, and I saw the questions. The questions seem to be focused on how can you do this? The world doesn't see it this way. We don't have a lot of choice, and I'd argue that you do have choice, and that you're not alone, and that there are entire communities out there that feel the way you do. And that you also have to be cautious about nonverbal stuff. I don't know if you had this experience, Ken, but it's my own kid who once says to me, I'm Jewish, do I have to be a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant? My son Lauren says this, and I'm like, and I'm very insulted, right? Because I never said anything of the sort to him. And I said, how could you say that to me? You could be many things. Where'd you come up with that? And he says, you don't have to. And he goes like this, meaning, look where we live, look where I go to school, look at the cars that kids drive, look at what my environment looks like. And I think that that's a good topic of conversation for kids who, when pressure is big, they tend to live in affluent areas, and there are signs all around them about what's valued. And I think it's critical that parents really think about what values they want to communicate and have that conversation over and over again. Sorry if I was strident, but
no, it's a subject worth stridency. There are 2 points that I want to make. Number one is speak the language of success, right? Speak that language and understand, because if you speak the language and you basically make it as if there's a choice between success and happiness, or success and creativity, or success and play, I got to tell you, I'm going to choose success.
Mm-hmm.
So instead, make it clear that the brand of success that is being promoted is actually wrong, and that it's because I care about long-term success that I do promote well-being, a sense of meaning, a commitment to justice, and creativity and play. It's because I care about success. So let's not go in the wrong, in different directions. And, Madeline began this night with a very important statement, which is that we're really talking about one slice of America right now. And It just needs to be said. And, we're living through a time of uncertainty where we're also having an awakening on all sorts of issues, including oppressive issues around racism. And it's really worth knowing that there are communities in America that have received very undermining messages and systemic forces that have interfered with their success. So if we care deeply about success, we are talking also about lowering barriers to success and promoting the well-being and thriving of every child in America.
And I think that has to be really intentional. Because I think, as people say, how can I do that in this country or whatever? I think the messages overt and covert about success, like when my son says, look at the cars that are driven around here, are strong. And unless you make that intentional messages about values, about what matters, about how you help other people. During COVID, Ken, I used to see kids out in my backyard, and just a stream of kids that were unhappy or depressed or anxious, whatever. And I'd like to say that I helped them because I'm such a good psychologist, but I really helped them because I was sort of like everybody else, unclear about what to do. And I ended up making a list of things they could do, right? Because doing something actually helps when you're feeling lousy. And so I gave them Jewish Family and Children's Service and Catholic services and Meals on Wheels. And then it was like, pick one, and I want you to report to me every day, 5 minutes, just check in with me. That was the best thing I think that was the best thing I did in my life as a therapist, was to, in terms of some of the things we're talking about, what are your values? Live them, do something, be proactive. And that helped.
From a resilience perspective, I'd like to underscore your point, which is that when young people have a sense of meaning and purpose, when young people feel like they're contributing to other people's lives, it's highly protective to them. Why? Because you learn how good it feels to serve. You're giving service, but you learn how good it feels to serve. And that means that ultimately, when they need to receive, because the ultimate act of resilience is to say, brother, sister, I need a hand, right? That's the ultimate act of resilience. But when you need to be on the other end, you can do so without shame or stigma, because you've given and you know how good it feels to give, and therefore you can receive. And just because I said shame or stigma, Alyssa, if you don't mind, let's make another point. We've talked a lot about anxiety. We've talked a lot about depression, and we've talked a lot about, rates going up. I just want to point out that it may be true that rates of depression and anxiety are going up, but I want to celebrate the fact that people are speaking out. I was a very depressed 17-year-old. That was 43 years ago. I've had a great life. I did not make a single statistic. Nobody would have known what I was experiencing because there was too much shame and stigma for me to seek help or to report myself. If I had gotten a survey, I would have made myself look joyful. So I want to celebrate that we have the opportunity here to know what people are thinking and feeling at greater levels than we ever have. And we have an opportunity during this common shared experience of COVID, as well as the racial awakening and all of the other things going on, that we have the opportunity to really reduce shame and stigma around the mental health seeking process. We can really celebrate people's strengths. We can point out to human beings that the power of human connection to heal. That's what I believe. Please God that I'm correct, but what I believe honestly is that this generation might be the best generation ever, because human connection was taken away from them. And that means that they are going to make human connection the central piece of what defines this generation. And if that happens, they're going to rock us into a better future.
Right. And also, I mean, mental health, I don't know what a mental is, Ken. Do you have a better word than mental illness? Like, how does your mental get sick? What is your mental?
Let's just say that we want emotional, spiritual well-being.
Yeah, it's
How about that? Okay.
better. It comes out and then it's like, I don't know what that is. But those issues have been front and center, right? It's in the paper every day. I do want to put a little caveat in there, and that's be careful about what you read in the papers, because I've given up reading and watching television because my original work was on the media and a lot of research on the more you watch, the worse the world feels. And so I've just kind of decided to do stuff and not pay as much attention, work locally. I'm working locally more than nationally, which I used to. And I think we don't know. And I think it's really important to say that, like Elisa, you said, all these rates are going up. Maybe, what we know is that as people come out, they're seeking more services. So for a while, the New York Times was just carrying all this stuff on higher rates of suicide. And I suspect that's right. But we also really don't know if that's delayed treatment. Like, I just want to say, we don't know the outcome of this. And my best guess is, in this audience, most of your kids will be okay. And we don't really know what the impact is, because we can look at World War II and the bombings and make guesses about it, but we've never been in isolation for 2 years. So I'm taking everything I read with caution, because it tends to be all bad news. And my own experience at this point is that a lot of kids, actually some kids did well. A socially phobic kid, an ADHD kid who could rock and get up. There were kids who did really well. And so we might be thinking about other forms of learning, or more expansive forms of learning than we did before. I think it's a great opportunity for a reset on education. Yeah.
Okay. Quite a few questions. This one kind of goes is a good segue. Do you really think, as the movie suggests, that children are more anxious and stressed out today than they were 30 years ago? Could part of it be that we are more aware of these issues today?
I think that this,
Go ahead. Yeah, no, go.
I think that this is what we just discussed.
Right.
I really can't compare data today to 30
Mhm.
years ago today. And I use myself as an example, 43 years ago, right?
Right.
So I don't know. What I do know is that children are deserving of our focused attention and love. And I do know that we should never be afraid to ask our children. I personally guarantee you that no child has become worried or thought of hurting themselves because a parent asked them, right?
Mhm.
So we should check in with our own experts, which are our children. We should look for appropriate clues that suggest that they're not doing well. And those appropriate clues can be found in many different places, including the Center for Parent and Teen Communication. And if I could tell you that one of my favorite articles in the Center for Parent and Teen Communication is an article that teaches parents or guides parents in the specific language to get your child to support in a strength-based way, the language of the strength it takes to seek help and what help can do for you. And I find that, and if someone could put that in chat, that would be great. If not, we can get it to you later. So we don't know, but we do know that human protection is protective. We do know that having a little bit of anxiety in some settings is good for people to be vigilant, to be cautious, right? And we do know how to support kids through the power of human connection.
I also think, Ken, it's important not to pathologize everything that comes up now in the middle of COVID, when people are expected to feel low and expected to be worried. And, when they come up with these really high rates, maybe, but I also think that there's a normality to, I don't know about you, but I've had a few bad days. I've had a few anxious days. And, you'd have to be living under a rock in this country not to feel anxiety about the politics and climate change. And the thing that actually worries me about that, I'm curious what you think, is that kids end up feeling, why bother? The country's falling apart, the world is falling apart, why bother? And that's probably the thing that concerns me the most. Is that anything you've come across?
Well, it's not something I've come across very much. It would be a grave concern to me if it happened. But let's frame what we want to make sure doesn't happen. So we expect uncertainty to be more uncomfortable for human beings, right? We are designed to be able to run from tigers. We're designed to see the stress right in front of us, and we have a whole hormonal system rooted in adrenaline that gets us ready to run and jump. But the scariest thing for humanity is not the tiger in front of us, it's that the tiger may be lurking in the grass. It's a different hormonal system. You need to be ready to jump at any time. So uncertainty is so uncomfortable,
Right.
So uncomfortable that people begin filling in the answers, whether that's with catastrophic thought, the tiger is big and ferocious and will destroy us, or you become susceptible to misinformation. Because uncertainty is so uncomfortable that you become susceptible to someone giving you an easy answer.
Right.
And some of those easy answers divide us because we begin blaming people. And history is full of these circumstances. Another easy answer is you can't do anything anyway, right? And that, Madeline, I would agree with you, might be one of the most dangerous things, because you can do something. You may not be able to answer everything, but life is a series of odds, and you make the right choices with the information you have. And you look for credible information, right? These are what we have to do in these times, and not be susceptible to the misinformation that will divide us or the misinformation that will make us powerless.
Right.
Oops, here we go. How do you suggest, can you hear me? How do you
Yes.
suggest we give kids constructive feedback in a way that doesn't feel like criticism or pressure, beyond emphasizing effort rather than end result? How can we frame advice in a way that feels supportive rather than oppressive?
Maybe this is just me. I feel like behind that question is somebody who's trying to figure out how to give their kid a hard time without making it look like they're giving a hard time, right? So what I have found as a clinician most helpful in terms of corrective experiences or getting kids to think about what they're doing is no kid, I'm sure, tell me if I'm wrong, Ken, no kid has ever sat in my office and said, I'm practicing 44 years, and said, my parents listen too much. Could you help me with that? Never, right? It's always my parents talk too much. And people, parents will say, what is it that you've done for my kid? Or, she's crazy about you. What do you do? And the reality is a lot of what you do is listen. And a lot of what you do is say, tell me more. It's really not rocket science that encouraging the connection from the kid to you is an awful lot of what therapy is about. Maybe I'm not the most sophisticated therapist, but it seems to work pretty well. So I think that if you stay focused on what your kid does well, as opposed to what he doesn't do so well, that you have a better relationship. The one thing you don't ever want to do is rupture your relationship with your child. And that doesn't mean you can't be critical, and that doesn't mean that you can't correct, but rupturing is when you get into their psychological space and make them feel small. And undoing that is my experience is that's very hard. So, if you want to correct your kid, it's a light touch and getting from your kid. So I'm assuming it's something like my kid doesn't work hard at something or doesn't pick up his clothes, and if it's more serious than that, that's a different discussion. And so I don't forget, Ken, we ought to talk about what parents look for that really is concerning for a moment, because we've talked about a wide range of things. And in a nutshell, it's intensity and change, I think. So if your child doesn't get out of bed for a day, I'm not concerned. If that child hasn't been out of bed for 2 weeks, I am concerned. If your child was kind of reclusive before, which most teenagers are, and they're a little more reclusive now, I'm not that concerned. If they won't interact for a week or two or a month, I am more concerned. So those are the two things that I look at, and I've totally lost the thread of the original question by going off in that direction. Take it away, Ken.
I think it was an important direction to go into. And the one thing I would add, particularly for adolescents, is irritability. Why? Because when young people look depressed in the way that adults look depressed, withdrawn, eating too much, not eating enough, sleeping too much, not sleeping enough, indeed they just say they're sad, we usually catch those kids because that's how we look for depression. But what we miss is that in children and adolescents, fully half of depressed kids aren't sad, they're irritable. And then one of the myths of adolescence is that all adolescents are moody. And as a result, we miss the adolescent who is presenting with irritability, and we call it normal. So we have to talk about the truths of adolescence, which is what my next book is all about, right? So we have to talk about, who adolescents really are. And then we have to notice the changes in irritability and check in. What is true is that your kid might be pulling away from you from home as a normal developmental process, but that shouldn't be happening in schools, right? They're with all of their peers in school. So if a kid is also irritable at the time at school, it's a real signal to look for. And just to underscore the other point, the person who asked the original question, Alyssa, was wanting to know how to give constructive feedback. And clearly that person knows about mindset and the importance of talking about effort and talking about what the young person is responsible for. And just to kind of bookend this conversation, knowing all that is good and right in your child is the most protective thing in a young person's life. It's how we began this conversation, and I think it's how we're going to end this conversation. Why? Because when we want a child to move into new territory, to stretch, or to correct a behavior, I'll tell you what never works is don't do this. Why? Because I said so, or you're a bad person and I'm ashamed of you. Will never work. When you talk about the inconsistencies of current behavior in the field of all of the young person's existing strengths, and you talk about, this is who I know you to be, and right now this is not consistent with your behavior, tell me what's going on, and let's draw from your existing strengths to solve this problem. So it really is all about that protective power of a parent seeing a young person as they deserve to be seen, not based on the behavior they might be displaying, and absolutely not based on a label they might have received. Okay.
Wow. All right. We have time for one more question. And that question is, how many after school activities are too much for a young child?
So depends on the child, depends on the activity. I want to make the point in all of this that there are some kids who do fine with a really tough schedule. And it's so I had 3 boys. One of them was fine with it, 2 weren't. There are kids who, I don't think we have to say that it's too much for every child. And it's the same kind of thing, like you can't say what's too much for a child. So I'd frame the question differently, which is how much time do children need to, at Challenge Success, we call it PDF, playtime, downtime, family time, that should be part of every child's life. And one of the things I sometimes do is have kids make a pie chart so I get to see what their day looks like. And it's usually, frankly, pretty crappy looking because they don't sleep enough and they're taking too many classes and they're doing too much homework. And so we insert a period of time for chilling. And, you know, Ken, I'm curious. When I was in high school, I came home every single day, laid on my bed and listened to Bob Dylan. 4 years of high school. That's what I did, half hour every day. And it you know, it was a place to look forward to decompress and all that. Taught me a lot about politics. But it was where I crafted a sense of self, right? Where I crafted, I like this, I don't like that. I'm strong in this, not so strong in that. And so I have less to say about how many activities is okay, and more to say about make sure that every day, and not just your child, but you as well, have some time that is not devoted to a structure that has no play. And I mean that in both senses of the word. And this really came home to me one day, Ken, when I was doing the talk at the Challenge Success, the big meeting, and I can't remember the name of the guy. I had flown in from New York. He had flown in from Hong Kong. And we're backstage going like, I'm tired. No, you know, I'm tired. I came from Hong Kong. Well, I came from New York. Well, I was in first class, but and we realized like we're competing about who's more screwed up, you know, who's more tired, who's done more. And it was important to see that like we're about to go out on a stage, talk about not doing that. And there we were. So, you know, keep an eye on, I think I'm saying keep an eye on yourself as well, because the same things that help your kids thrive, help you thrive as well.
Amen. I mean, I don't think I could say anything better. Just think of this. When do your most creative ideas pop into your head? I bet it's when you're not planning on having them pop into your head, right? If you just sit there and go, be creative, figure this out, it doesn't happen. And sometimes it's in the shower, it's downtime is where your brain really does its best work in creativity, but also in solidifying knowledge. You need some downtime to solidify knowledge. And that's the answer. Like I wanted as a joke to go 3. Like there's no answer. There's no specific answer. And let me say one other thing about adolescent development. People worry about their kids quitting activities. No child of mine would be a quitter. Adolescents should be choosing different things. They should be pruning back so they can develop their spikes. Mm-hmm. And so I would rather see a kid who's intensely interested in something and pursuing it because it's giving them passion in life than having a kid dabble in 7 things. And I don't think it's just me. I think college admission processes have recognized that they'd rather see a kid who's deeply engaged in something than a dilettante.
Well, that was a lively, wonderful discussion. I appreciate the 2 of you coming to join us here tonight, and thank you.
You know, I have one more thing to say, and I think, and that is one, thank you very much, Elisa. Ken, I've known forever. I just adore you, as you well know. And you can see from the questions, the anxiety that parents have about getting it right. And I appreciate people's anxiety. The basic instinct we have around connection is the most important thing you do. as a parent. It's not how many activities, it's none of that stuff. It's exactly what Ken said early on in this about seeing the child in front of you, getting to know your kid. And I have no pill to help people feel a little less anxious, but try. Most kids grow up, even when they've had things put in their way, you know, Ken, whether it was ADHD or for me, it was an anxiety disorder. Most of us grow up, and usually parents have pretty good instincts about their own children. So I'd like to
Thank you again.
Sure.
All right. Well, thank you all for participating in tonight's event. On behalf of myself and Madeline and Ken, I would like to thank you for all of your great questions. And if you have not already, please take a moment to provide feedback on tonight's event by filling out a brief survey. The link to the survey is in the chat. And I want to thank you again and have a good evening.